She stepped onto the rugged training ground before sunrise, and the cold morning air clung to her skin as she moved with slow, steady purpose. The sky was washed in a pale gray that made the world feel suspended, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold. She carried no swagger and no attempt to prove herself through loud words. Instead, she carried a steady calm, like someone who had already survived far worse storms in silence. This calm held the attention of the veterans who were used to swagger, confidence, and bravado from anyone daring enough to approach their domain. SEALs gathered near the starting point of the endurance course, their whispers barely audible, but still sharp enough to slice the morning quiet. Some chuckled, others smirked, and a few simply crossed their arms, curious to see how long she would last. She heard every sound, but let none of it settle into her. Instead, she studied the terrain ahead. The uneven ground, the steep inclines, the rope climbs, the freezing water stations, and the brutal run that had humbled many strong candidates before her. She was not military, not part of any unit, and not backed by any organization. She was simply a civilian with a history she did not speak of, and a reputation for pushing the edge of human endurance in quiet corners where no one kept track. Yet something in her stance made even the most seasoned operators pause. She did not look eager. She did not look afraid. She simply looked ready. One of the instructors approached her with a dry smile, as if giving her a final chance to reconsider. He asked if she understood the rules, if she knew the intensity, if she realized not a single outsider had ever completed the full test. She nodded once with the same calm expression, and the instructor felt the faintest thread of doubt tug at his certainty. Still, he gestured her forward and returned to the group, shaking his head as if already predicting her retreat. The whistle had not yet blown, and she stood alone at the starting line. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sea salt from the distant coast, and the sharp smell of worn rope and metal from the obstacles scattered ahead. Her heartbeat remained slow, steady, almost measured, as if synced with the rhythm of the rising sun. She flexed her fingers once, warmed her breath in her palms, and let her focus narrow until the world around her softened to a distant murmur behind her. The SEALs exchanged bets on how many minutes she would last. Some guessed 5, others generously 10. A few joked that she might not even make it to the first incline, and their laughter drifted through the cold air like a taunt. She heard none of it, or rather, she chose to let none of it reach her center. She had trained for this, even if not officially. Her training had come from life, from the kind that does not make headlines. The kind learned in remote mountains where she had run steep trails with a weighted pack until her legs trembled. The kind learned in icy rivers where she had held her breath and fought currents until her lungs screamed. The kind learned while carrying responsibilities far heavier than equipment long before she ever stepped onto this field. When the whistle finally blew, the sharp sound cut through the morning like a blade, and she launched forward. With a pace neither frantic nor hesitant, she moved like someone who knew exactly how much to give and when to give it. The first incline rose sharply ahead, and she approached it with long, balanced strides, shifting her weight with practiced ease. The SEALs watched, expecting her to slip or falter, but she reached the top with steady efficiency and kept going without a pause. Her breathing stayed controlled as she crossed the uneven ground that twisted ankles and forced many to slow. She moved like water around the jagged dips and small stones, her eyes scanning ahead, predicting each shift in the earth. The SEALs began to quiet as their expectations clashed with what they were seeing. She reached the rope climb, the first true trial that separated those who could endure from those who merely believed they could. The ropes dangled overhead, rough and frayed, and the height intimidated even trained operators. She paused for a single breath, then leaped, grabbed the rope, and descended with a rhythm that made the watching crowd shift uneasily. There was no wasted movement, no burst of showy strength, only precise pulls and controlled breaths. When she reached the top, she did not revel in it, nor hesitate. She transitioned to the descent and hit the ground with a soft thud, her steps already driving her toward the next. Challenge. The quiet among the seals deepened as if someone had turned down the volume of the world as she approached the cold water trench. The wind whipped harder, chilling her sweat and raising goosebumps across her arms. She stepped into the icy water without a flinch. Her muscles tightened, but her expression remained unchanged. She moved through the trench with methodical determination. Ignoring the shock to her system, the water reached her shoulders, then her chest, then her neck, yet she pressed on her focus. Unbroken, merging from the freezing trench, she shook the water from her face and resumed her pace as though the cold had only sharpened her resolve. The instructors exchanged glances, some impressed, some confused, none willing to admit how unexpected this was. She continued the run, approaching the steep, natural ridge that forced candidates to crawl, scramble, and fight gravity with every part of their body. She advanced upward, using her hands, arms, legs, and core, each motion deliberate. She did not look strong in a showy way, but strong in the quiet, unstoppable way of someone who had mastered her own limits. Halfway up the ridge, a gust of wind nearly pushed her sideways, but she adjusted instantly, shifting her center of gravity and digging her fingers deeper into the dirt. The seals, watching from below, leaned forward, instinctively sensing the tension. Even they had struggled at this point during their initial training, but she kept climbing, her breath steady, her gaze fixed ahead. When she reached the top of the ridge, she paused only long enough to sweep her hair away from her eyes and take in the view of the remaining course. She did not smile or celebrate. She simply kept going, and the men watching her felt the faint stir of unease, not at her strength, but at the calm with which she carried it. She ran the next stretch with long, purposeful strides, the cold wind drying the remaining water from her clothes and cooling her muscles. She maintained the same calm tempo that suggested she had more energy to spare, far more than anyone had predicted. The instructors began timing her with a seriousness they had not expected to need this morning, and whispers spread again, though now tinged with surprise instead of amusement. Her presence shifted the atmosphere. The men who had joked earlier now watched with sharpened attention, as if witnessing something rare and significant, something beyond endurance, something beyond ego purse. It was the way she ran, as though she carried a story beneath her skin, one she never spoke, but which spoke for her with every step she took, every obstacle she overcame, every quiet breath she drew on as she continued forward deeper into the course. The seals realized something unspoken. This was not simply a test for her. It was a reckoning, a moment she had been walking toward for years. Since she was just getting started, the sun had climbed higher by the time she pushed past the next series of obstacles, and the ground was warming, but her focus remained cold and unwavering. The seals followed her progress with growing unease, their earlier amusement settling into silence, as though the air itself understood that something unusual was unfolding. She moved through the course with a rhythm that defied expectation, not rushing, not dragging, simply flowing forward with a quiet determination that made the toughest operators shift their weight in discomfort. The midpoint of the test loomed ahead, a brutal sequence designed to break even the strongest of candidates. It included sandbag carries, sled pulls, weighted crawls, and an exhausting sprint that drained the last reserves of those who had already struggled through the earlier challenges. Yet when she approached the sandbags, she lifted one with a steady, clean movement that lacked hesitation. She positioned it on her shoulder with practiced balance and began her march across the uneven terrain. Sandbag weighed as much as some candidates, and the shifting load forced even trained soldiers to fight for their footing. She, however, adjusted with each step, letting the weight roll gently across her shoulder until it settled into a position where it almost seemed part of her. She moved with that quiet rhythm again, the same one she had shown on the rope climb and in the freezing trench, a rhythm that belonged not to someone performing, but to someone who had lived through training that no official course could replicate. The seals exchanged glances as she reached the end of the sandbag path, set it down with controlled precision, and proceeded to the next challenge without pausing. Her breath was heavier now, but still measured, and her expression had not shifted towards strain. The instructor, trailing behind her, scribbled something on his clipboard, his jaw tightening as he checked the time again. Next came the sled pull, a test of brute force and grit. The sled was weighted heavily, and the ground beneath it was rough. The moment she gripped the harness, the wind picked up again. As if testing her resolve, she leaned forward, dug her feet into the ground, and pulled. The sled resisted, at first refusing to move. Then, slowly, steadily, she dragged it forward inch by inch, until it gained momentum and glided across the field with harsh scraping sounds that echoed through the open space. Her muscles strained visibly, yet her eyes stayed locked ahead. The SEALs watching could no longer hide their surprise. It was one thing to endure with technique and finesse, but this part required raw strength, and she had it far beyond what any of them had imagined. She finished the pull and dropped the harness, stepping back with slow, deliberate breaths. She did not look at the men watching, nor did she acknowledge their shifting gazes. She simply moved toward the weighted crawl, a challenge that drove most candidates to collapse halfway through. The crawl forced her onto the ground beneath a network of low beams, forcing her body to stay almost flat against the earth. The added weight strapped to her back made her movements slow and grinding. Dirt pressed into her palms and knees. The SEALs expected to see her falter here, where the mental pressure and physical exhaustion combined to break the strongest spirits, but she continued forward, inch by inch, her breaths growing louder, though never panicked. She squeezed under each beam, keeping her center low and her movements controlled. There was no wasted energy, no dramatic struggle, only relentless progress. The instructors watched in stunned silence as she reached the end of the crawl, rolled to her feet, and steadied herself with one hand on her thigh. Sweat dripped from her jaw, and her clothes were torn and coated in dirt, but her eyes held the same calm as when she had begun. She looked at the final task of the midpoint, the sprint that forced every candidate to dig into whatever reserves they had left. She inhaled slowly, exhaled once, and then launched forward with a burst of speed that startled even the most seasoned operators. Her legs moved like pistons, driving her across the field with surprising force. She leaned into the wind, letting her momentum carry her. She did not slow at the halfway marker, nor did she stumble near the finish. She crossed the line with a fierce forward thrust, catching herself before her momentum carried her further. SEALs stared, some with open mouths, others with narrowed eyes, trying to understand what they were witnessing. They had seen determination before, but this was different. This was someone who had arrived with no reputation to defend, no rank to uphold, and no audience to impress, yet she was performing with the tenacity of someone who had fought battles far beyond this course. And, as she stood at the end of the midpoint section, chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths, the SEALs realized something that none of them spoke aloud. She might not just finish this test, she might redefine it. The final stretch of the course stretched before her like a silent gauntlet, and the SEALs, who had once stood with folded arms, now followed her every movement with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The last phase was always the breaking point, where muscles trembled, where lungs burned, and where even the strongest candidates found themselves wrestling with doubt. Yet she stepped into it with the same steady presence she had carried since the beginning, as though the exhaustion tightening around her body was only another weight to be managed, not a force capable of stopping her. The first challenge of the last phase was a brutal endurance carry, a test that required hoisting a heavy training dummy across a rugged terrain scattered with debris, uneven hills, and low-hanging branches that forced each candidate to navigate carefully or risk falling. She approached the dummy and paused only long enough to tighten her grip around its torso. Then, with a controlled exhale, she lifted the weight onto her shoulders and began her march. Her steps were deliberate but not hesitant, the dummy bouncing slightly with each movement as she adjusted to its shifting bulk. The path beneath her feet offered no mercy. Each step demanded strength, balance, and focus. Yet her eyes stayed fixed ahead, her muscles trembled, but she did not slow. She moved like someone who had carried far heavier burdens long before this day, burdens that had shaped her into something the SEALs had not expected. The instructors watched her traverse the uneven hills, waiting for the moment she might falter. Yet instead of faltering, she grew steadier, as though the weight on her shoulders reminded her of a familiar struggle, one she had mastered long ago. Her breaths came in deep, steady waves, and by the time she reached the end of the carry, she lowered the dummy with a softness that contrasted the brutality of the task. She allowed herself one breath, one moment to reset her stance before stepping into the next challenge, a high wall slick with moisture from the ocean air. Its height forced even tall operators to strategize, and its surface punished anyone who attempted to climb it. Without precision, she studied the wall for a brief moment, then sprinted forward, planted her foot against the base, and launched upward, catching the edge with both hands. Her fingers clung to the slippery surface, yet she held firm, pulling herself upward with a slow, controlled motion that forced every muscle in her arms and core to strain. For a moment, she hung suspended mid-climb, and the SEALs watching felt a collective tension rise in their chests. Then, with a final, powerful pull, she swung her leg over the top of the wall and dropped to the other side, landing in a crouch. She stood quickly, her breath visible in the cool afternoon air, and continued toward the final stretch, a long, grueling run that determined not only survival, but time, and she was on track to break more than just expectations. The long run at the end of the test was designed as the final blow to both the body and the mind. The terrain shifted constantly from soft sand to rocky patches to steep ascents that punished tired legs. Her strides were slower now, her muscles tight from hours of exertion, yet her focus did not waver. She ran with the steady determination of someone moving toward something greater than a finish line. Something personal, something she did not speak of. The SEALs ran alongside her, now not mockingly, but respectfully, maintaining a distance yet staying close enough to witness the moment. Her breaths grew harsher, her pace threatened to falter, but each time it did, she found another reserve somewhere deep within herself and pushed onward. Her steps carved a path through the sand, her shoulders squared, her gaze forward, never drifting back. As she neared the final ascent, the steep incline that marked the last true obstacle, the wind roared again, pushing against her like a final challenge. Her legs trembled from fatigue, and for the first time she stumbled, dropping briefly to one knee. The instructors inhaled sharply, thinking the moment had come when her body finally refused to obey. But she planted her hands against the ground, pushed herself upright, and continued climbing, inch by inch, step by step, refusing to yield. When she reached the top, she paused for only a heartbeat, her silhouette sharp against the afternoon sky, then descended with renewed determination. The finish line waited in the distance, marked by a simple flag and a crowd of silent men who had long since forgotten their early amusement. She crossed the final stretch with nothing left in her body, but everything left in her spirit. Her strides small but unbroken, her eyes fierce with the last remnants of resolve. And when she stepped past the line, the timer showed a number that shattered the previous record setting. A new standard that none had imagined possible. For a long moment, no one spoke. The SEALs stood in a quiet circle around her, watching her breathe, watching the way she steadied herself. Without pride or fanfare, she had not come to impress them. She had not come for recognition. She had come to prove something only she understood. And in that silent moment, the SEALs realized that they had witnessed more than endurance, more than strength. They had witnessed the power of a person who carried their battles inside their bones and faced every obstacle with quiet, relentless will, and none of them would ever look at the course the same way again.